This build is already crushing high tier maps and bosses without even having chosen an ascendancy. I'm asking you to take part in that choice by leaving a comment below on what ascendancy you would have picked for this build and why. Because when in doubt, let the internet make life-altering decisions for you. Now, this build is mainly based on chaos damage over time and most of all poison damage. We either create a smoke cloud ourselves by sacrificing our 4 skeleton brutes or simply thrash a mob with hex blast to generate a corpse. Yes, the skeleton brutes are the real MVPs of this build. They show up just to die and fuel our chaos domination. True team players. But how does minion and monster deaths trigger a smoke cloud, you might ask? Stay tuned to find out, but first let's look at the following chain of events. As soon as the poison cloud is generated, we place 2 dark effigy totems. Now these totems will fire 1 projectile per damage over time debuff on the enemies. When enemies enter the poison cloud, they will quickly reach 4 poison stacks, meaning that they will be bombarded by 4 projectiles per totem, so 8 projectiles in total. We'll soon look at how we obtain that many poison stacks, but first, after the totems have been summoned, we also cast Contagion on one enemy, a powerful damage over time debuff that spreads on death to other enemies. Now the enemies will be long dead by now, but if they weren't, we could also from afar spam Essence Drain to apply further damage over time debuffs, while also spreading Contagion to other enemies through the projectile hit. This would in turn make the dark effigy totems fire even more projectiles at the enemies. If enemies for some reason get too close to us, we have the powerful Hex Blast spell to kill them fast to generate new smoke clouds. Now there's one important thing that needs to be in place for Hex Blast to work, and we'll soon look at what, but first let's look at how the smoke clouds are generated. First of all, the smoke cloud is generated from a corpse and by us moving. This means that every time we move, we'll consume a corpse to trigger the smoke cloud. That's right, this build literally runs on corpses. It's eco-friendly, in a very upsetting way. Anyway, this is why when we summon our skeleton brutes and move, they will instantly be consumed to trigger a smoke cloud. This also applies for when we thrash enemies so that they generate corpses. The item that makes this possible is the corpse weight boots. Now these boots gives us a skill Decompose that will trigger on steps, so basically whenever we move. This skill uses a corpse to generate a smoke cloud that will expand by each second. It deals poison damage, so chaos damage over time, by a percentage of the corpse's life, meaning that using corpses with more life such as rare and magic mobs will give the poison cloud more damage. For clearing, we can use Hex Blast to defeat an enemy to trigger the first smoke cloud, but for bosses this doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. Bosses have to ruin everything. That's basically their job. This is why we want as much life as possible on our skeleton brute minions, so that when we use them to generate corpses through the sacrifice skill, the decomposed poison cloud will do more damage. There are some important details we will look at soon that need to be in place for the skeleton brutes to have as much life as possible, but first let's have a closer look at the decompose skill. For decompose, we use the comorbidity support to add an additional poison stack, and since we also have 2 more poison stacks from the passive tree, this amounts to 4 total stacks on top of the 1 base stack. As mentioned, when these poison clouds are active, we place 2 dark effigy totems. 2 totems that work even harder than a boomer on a cup of coffee. Now the most important thing to note here is that we use the Withering Touch support gem to wither enemies on hit, which increases the chaos damage they take. Also we use the Envenom support so that the totems can also apply poison to enemies. This is especially effective for bosses to maintain all the poison stacks so that the totems fire as many projectiles as possible. Totem warfare, when just a regular cloud of death isn't enough. And when speaking of bosses, let's look at the Contagion skill. Now for this skill we use the Chaotic Freeze support gem. When enemies take damage over time from this skill, any chaos damage hit they receive from any source will contribute to freeze buildup. This means that all hits from our totems will give freeze buildup and eventually freeze them. Now, if you've enjoyed this video so far, make sure to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more upcoming PoE2 videos. Remember I mentioned we use the skeleton brutes with sacrifice for generating corpses for decompose? They're basically the interns of this build. Show up, get sacrificed, and nobody remembers their names. To achieve this, we have 2 different weapon sets for this build. One for our basic spell setup and one dedicated entirely to having as many skeleton brutes as possible. For the latter weapon set, we also assign minion life passive nodes to increase their life as much as possible, thus increasing the damage of decompose. Arctic armor is basically your emergency blanket for this build, since we have the armor of a wet paper bag. But hey, it keeps us alive long enough to throw more poison around, right? Let's have a look at the most important passive nodes. Stay tuned for the final nodes we'll have a look at here, because they are vital game changers for this build. The Dark Entries nodes gives +1 level of all chaos skills, which especially scales Dark Effigy and Hex Blast very well. For Energy Shield, the Patient Barrier and Pure Energy are mandatory, as Energy Shield is our most important defensive layer. Now let's look at how we scale poison damage specifically. We go and take the Building Toxins and Stacking Toxins to get an additional 2 poison stacks, which gives us 4 in total with our base stack and a stack from the Comorbidity support gem. This in combination with the Leeching Toxins node gives us an immense poison damage boost, as well as recovering 2% of our life whenever a poisoned enemy dies. The closest thing to health insurance you'll get in Rayclast. As for gear, there are 2 mandatory things to note. The first one is obviously the corpse weight boots, giving us the decompose skill, the heart of this build. It is very important to get the highest level possible for this skill, which at this moment in time is level 18. Apart from that, also make sure you have the highest percentage of movement speed for these boots, which is 10%. In other words, prepare to lag behind while everyone else zooms past you when the leagues arrive. And yes, this is one of the downsides of this build, namely that you're missing out on the remaining 20% movement speed that is possible to achieve on regular boots. Apart from that, we need 145 spirit to run all of our precision skills for our main weapon set, so you will need to add spirit on your gear, such as body armor and amulet. For a skeleton root weapon set, we ideally want minimum 284 spirit, which is why we use a scepter with 42% increased spirit as well. Now, as I mentioned in the start of this video, I want you to take part in what ascendancy to pick for this build, because democracy works, right? What could possibly go wrong? Even without picking an ascendancy, this build is already extremely powerful and fun to play, and can clear the highest tier content without any problems, so you could easily play this build as it is already. Now, what ascendancy do you think this build should go for? Leave a comment below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and check out the description for more Path of Exile 2 videos. Because if you didn't ask for subs, was it even a real build guide?